very kind introduction, and makes me think we have a lot to talk about today. So I updated my slides, and as I'm sitting there, I'm looking at them, and I realize, there's a major update that has not been made to the front slide. So no, it is not August 19th, 2012, when I presented this work to the American Sociological Association meetings in Denver. The date has changed, and my title has changed. I'm now an associate professor of sociology, and including the new titles that we'll talk about in the second part. But a lot of this research I thought would be relevant when Anne asked if I would be interested in doing some kind of talk, and I thought that it would be interesting to talk about the diversity work that has not really happened so much at these kind of senior co-housing communities, and then the kind of diversity work that is happening now at Willamette. And there are some overlaps here in terms of being communities that were intentionally designed for, not maliciously, but just intentionally designed for the group of people that they were intended to serve, which at the time of Willamette's creation was, typically younger, sort of college age, in quotes, white middle-class men. And so when you have an institution that's designed to serve that particular group, and you then end up over the 176, today is Willamette's birthday, I don't know if you all know that, but on our 176th birthday, our population of students, staff, and faculty look quite different. And so how do we then deliberately go back to the way the school was designed and who it was designed to serve, to then rearrange the organization and make a deliberate effort to serve a new kind of community? And that's what's happening at these senior co-housings too. A group of folks got together, and they tended to look a lot like the group of folks that I see in front of me. They tend to be white, middle class, and often women, and I can talk a little bit more about that too. And they thought about what community would best serve their needs, even though they also recognized that they wanted to be inclusive and serve a wide range of folks. And so they're kind of trying to balance now this value that they have towards equity and inclusion, but also the way their communities were designed and how they went about organizing the structure. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. Some of you might be quite familiar with senior co-housing, and others may be hearing this for the first time. Is anyone in the audience currently living in a co-housing community right now? Oh, okay, great. Well, we have experts in the audience then. All right, I am going to strip down a little. It's quite warm. Okay. So here we see some folks enjoying an evening hour at one of the co-housing communities. I think this one's in Boulder. I have some random photos. None of the photos that you'll see on the presentation today are ones that I've taken. I often take photos when I do my research, but I use them internally because I don't have permission from the folks to share them. So these are all photos that I've taken from the internet of real communities, but they're their publicity shots. So, and I want to talk a little bit about the publicity. So notice who's in the pictures when I show them to you. See, in this case, we see sort of a mix of men and women. Okay, so what is co-housing? Co-housing is a small-scale community, usually 20 to 40 units. They're neighborhoods that are planned and developed and managed by members. So it's not like a community where an external group has come in and done all of the work in the building and then is just selling the units. These folks have been usually getting together at libraries or coffee shops or whatever for months and months and months, trying to self-organize, doing potlucks, getting their paperwork together so that they can put a plan to the city and get permission and buy a piece of land and hire a developer who specifically knows how to work with these kinds of communities. So it's a big process, and they're very intentional about it, which is why it falls under the umbrella term of an intentional community. So typically, each of these communities has 20 to 40 fully equipped private units. And what I mean by fully equipped is like they have bathrooms and kitchens. Everybody, it's not like a dorm situation where you just have a bedroom. Everybody has a private home. And then there's also a large common home or a large common space. And that offers a balance between privacy and community living. It's also an ecological factor where people's homes can be smaller. They might not need 2 extra bedrooms because for when their family comes back to visit, because they think, well, there's the common house. The common house has some bedrooms that people can stay in when they come. And if we do have a big party, I don't need a huge extra living room to host family because I can just rent out the common room and we can host in there, or, those kinds of things. So that the ways in which a lot of Americans want a big house because of the few times that they might use that space, this allows folks to have a smaller home, more manageable to clean, more manageable to take care of, while also having the amenities of a larger space. So, and the whole co-housing concept came out of Denmark in the 1970s and has since really, you know, taken off across the world and continues to be very popular in Denmark, or in Copenhagen, or yeah, in Denmark and a lot of Northern European countries. So right now in the US, there's currently around 200 co-housing communities and about 13 completed senior co-housing communities, which are 55 and plus. I think 2 more are in the building stages and 13 more are in that forming stage where a lot of folks are getting together and buying land and planning, but they're not living there yet. So it's a growing trend. We tend to see it mostly in, like, the Southwest tends to have some, because I think a lot of seniors want to live down there anyway, but there are some all over, including, I think, one just opening in Portland, Oregon, like last month, a new one, which might be one of the now 14 completed. Because a lot of folks do live in regular co-housing, not senior co-housing, which is intergenerational co-housing, where you would have young families, singles, you know, all across the age spectrum, including some folks that are older. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why, when I asked the folks in the co-housing unit why they specifically chose the 55 plus, the kind of answers they gave me about, you know, not necessarily wanting to live in an intergenerational one. But a lot of people do. They like to be around the kids. Okay. Okay, so the intentions of senior co-housing, when you think about the options for aging seniors in terms of living circumstances, there's of course living in place in your own home, which a lot of people opt to do. That can be a little bit socially isolating for folks, depending on the kind of community they have. They might not want to take on the responsibility of a larger family home that once housed, you know, generations and now is just 1 or 2 folks. They might also look at nursing homes, which can kind of have an institutional hospital feel sometimes, and they're very expensive. They often provide great medical services, but a lot of which people might not need right away, right? So you know that it's there if you need it, but if you don't need it, you don't really want to pay for this hospital-like environment that is, you know, quite expensive and feels a little bit cold. There's also, you know, the kind of the Sun City type places that work for some folks, but tend to be farther away from their communities of origin, tend to be away from their families, tend to be expensive, and tend to focus a lot on sort of recreational activities, which for some people is exactly what they would like to do, and for others, that isn't their idea of how they want to spend their end of life years, is playing bingo or going to, you know, comedy shows or having folks come in and sing. It's more, they want something that feels to them, at least the way they explained it to me, deeper, more authentic, more about community engagement, social justice, about, you know, giving back to the community, about thinking through end of life issues with people who were interested in processing that kind of stuff. So it was a kind of a different focus from what they perceived the Sun City resorts to be, kind of, you know, everybody's drinking margaritas and sitting by the pool. So these communities provide an alternative to active retirement communities that are focused on recreation and are larger and more expensive. They also are an alternative to aging alone in a private residence. And this is the part I was talking about, where they just focus on a spiritual aspect of aging, environmentalism, activism, and creating deep relationships. And because the process of forming one of these is long and often challenging, there's a lot of conflict that can occur as people try to figure out what their community will look like. It also can, as much as that sounds bad, like, oh gosh, it'd be easier if we could just move into one, it creates these really deep bonds among the community members as well. So they get through this challenging process together and they feel like more of a tight-knit family in a way. Okay. So this study that I'm going to be talking about right now was a longitudinal study that I did of one particular community in New Mexico. And I went there twice, and I did the first set of interviews when they were in the planning phase. So I met with a number of the original members who had, you know, just purchased the land. They were excited about it. They had gotten a good deal on the land from the city. They felt good about the transportation options because this is a popular tourist destination town. It's a really well-loved town, and so therefore it's kind of expensive to live there. And so the city had cut them a break by a piece of land that was a little bit further from downtown, but they were going to have a bus access. And so they were excited about that, but they still had a lot of things to do because, of course, when the city gives you a break on certain things, they want other things from, your community. So it's a give and take with the community. They didn't have any buildings yet. Then I went back for a second set of interviews, and by that point, it was a 29-unit community. 19 of the units had been filled, and 10 of the units were vacant, and they were actively recruiting members to join their community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that recruiting process as well. And then on this presentation, you'll see a lot of quotes from members. Most of the quotes are quotes that I got from when I did interviews with them, and occasionally there are quotes that people, they have websites where they would type up their experiences and stuff. So I pull a little bit of that in, and just to be clear about where this information is coming from. Okay. Are there any questions? I mean, I'm happy. I know I'll stop and let time to answer questions, but if you have any questions as we go, I'm more than happy, especially if they're clarifying and I can quickly answer. Okay, I'll keep going. All right, so the demographics of this community, aged 55 to 85. You had to be at least 55 to get into the community. Most of the communities are 55 plus. And, but then mostly they were within the 60 to 73 range. That was, even though there were some folks on either end, the majority were in that kind of middle group. They were 100% white, 18 women and 3 men. Most of them had children and were divorced or widowed, and there was one lesbian couple who was joining. And then most had lived communally before, and I always thought that was really interesting, that oftentimes for folks returning to community, they had at least some short stint of communal living in their youth, and then left that when they wanted to settle down with a partner and raise their kids and sort of do that middle step of life, and then they recognized that they had missed this piece of living communally with like-minded folks and wanting to return to that. So that was interesting. And then most of them were middle class and former professionals. They had, professional type jobs of all kinds. Okay. Some were still working at the time as well. Okay. All right, so when we talk about why did they choose this particular community, why a 55 plus and not a regular intergenerational co-housing community? And a lot of it was just like, kids are noisy and they're dirty and they scream a lot, and they take up a lot of space, right? It takes a lot of energy for a community to have children around, whether they're small children that need constant supervision and, break things unintentionally but do, or they're teenagers who are their own kind of challenge. And so a lot of the folks were just like, we've done the kid thing, we have great relationships with our kids and grandkids, we don't really want to be babysitters for other people's kids. And so we are interested in that. Now, had I done interviews with folks who live in intergenerational communities, I think I would have heard largely the opposite. A lot of folks love kids, don't have access to kids anymore, and just really appreciate the energy and excitement that kids bring. So this is just how people self-selected in this way. They told me that society was focused too much on youth, and and other folks were like, when I was looking for a community, this one was available and it was affordable, and I could have gone either way, but so it was. The problems that they saw with the 55 plus is that sometimes they felt embarrassed when their grandkids came to visit, because in a community that doesn't really have that many kids, it doesn't have a playground, and the kids would run around in the street and make noise and do things. And of course, when it's your grandchildren, you're like, they could do no wrong, but the other people are looking at your grandkids like, could you please, manage this scene right here? So there was that. And then they were also, unrelated to children, thinking about the labor issues. And we'll come back to this later when we talk about gender, but I think it's a really interesting thing, because as much as they want to live communally with folks like them in age-wise, they also recognize that there are things that need to happen in a community. Gutters need to get cleaned, and just firewood cut, or some kind of moving stuff that sometimes it's nice to have some strong adult people there who are confident and capable to do that, rather than always trying to hire someone to come and do that work because it's more expensive. So those were some of the issues. They were like, that's the trade-off, is to not have that. And a lot of them did feel, in very good health. They just weren't really excited to climb up on a ladder and fix something on the roof that needed fixing. So, and they were also then worried about care, because as much as most people in that community were in good health, they knew that at some point they would need additional care. And when you have that intergenerational piece, then you can, the younger people can care for the older people, and then, when they become the older people, there's a generation behind them to help that. So there was some concerns there that they were taking a risk with only aging in place with people that were older. And I don't know, I can't remember if I have a slide on this, but I wanted to briefly talk about health care, because they had made pre-arrangements about what that would look like. So there was this sense that if somebody was sick with the flu, or had, a knee surgery, or something that had an end in sight, right, where we knew that you're going through this hard time right now, and we also know that you're going to get better, then the community would rally, take them to doctor's appointments, bring them food, make sure that their needs were taken care of. Obviously not, high-level medical care, but just that basic human care that people need. But then if that person was going to need sort of more long-term, higher intense care, they had made a little apartment in their common house that was either currently available for when family came to visit, but would eventually get used for sort of an on-site nursing person who could take care of maybe multiple people that were in need of that kind of care. So they had that in planned, not assuming that the 55-year-old or that whoever was going to be sick, first was going to get the full care forever of the other members. So this was an interesting thing that they had figured out. Okay, so I'm going to have just a few images now to show you, and just spend a little time looking at them so you can get a sense of what these might look like in your mind. They're often, quite beautiful. One thing I think you'll notice is that there aren't any driveways, and that's quite deliberate. They often want to keep a parking lot off to the side, and that way when folks, leave that parking lot, you're in a more pedestrian-friendly environment. And it's a real move away from a traditional neighborhood feel where there's a road that separates the houses, and then everybody has a driveway that you drive your car into, and then there's really very little reason for interaction among the neighbors. So, another one. There's also usually, as you'll see here, some kind of garden area. This one may or may not be a senior co-housing. I see playgrounds and then the garden area. Most of the senior co-housing communities have very small garden areas, and no one's going to take care of that huge plot of land back there. Okay, but here's what the inside of a common house might look like. They often set up like, okay, Thursday nights is the potluck night, and we all eat dinner together, and then on Tuesday nights is book club, and they plan events in there. This is a beautiful one in Boulder. A render of one that's yet to be built, or maybe has been by now, I'm not sure. Okay, so now I want to talk about the diversity piece, now that I've sort of set the stage of what these communities look like and who lives there. So there's definitely a value stated, deliberately on these communities' websites and their materials, and even as you talk to them, that they want diversity, they recognize the importance of diversity, and they feel confused sometimes about why they don't have diversity. And so a lot of the quotes from now on will be them thinking through why they want it and why they don't have it. So members recognize the absence of racial, class, and gender diversity and use several strategies to either address it, deny it, reject it. They use this kind of common language that you see, not specific to these kinds of communities. You could hear the same language being used around Willamette too. Like, well, we want these folks to come, but nobody applies. So what are you going to do? It's like faculty of color, right? We hear that a lot. We need to diversify our faculty. It was like, well, when you get 100 applications and there are very few faculty of color's applications in there, then what are you going to do about that? And so that's where the active steps need to happen. And so these folks are like, we can't determine who's going to come here because that's who's here, and that's who shows up to our meetings, and that's who we, accept as members. So many folks really wanted to join our community, this is a quote, because of its diversity, but these were mostly white folks. So they had all sailed through our membership process. Had they all sailed through our membership process, we'd be pretty out of balance in the ethnicity race category. So again, that's like they're acknowledging that that's who's coming and that's who seems most interested. Okay. So when they talk about diversity and they feel like, no, we don't have the kind of diversity that you're talking about, race, class, gender, or ethnic diversity, but we have diversity in other ways, and that often gets used as a mechanism to say, like, we know we don't have that, but we still feel good about the diversity that we have. And here's what they say: we cherish and celebrate our diverse origins, joys, talents, beliefs, and life experiences. So even though we all come from the same racial, class, and gender, background, well, we like different things. Susie's into ballet, and I like the opera, so we're diverse. Okay. I consider myself a clear example of diversity. This is another white member. I'm not black or gay or poverty-stricken or elderly or in a wheelchair or speak English as a second language or in any demographic category that counts as minority. My type transcends all that. And when I think of diversity, I don't think of these layers. I think of where real differences are inside a person. I think the standard conception of what diversity is pretty thin. Convenient, but thin. So it's a reframing of the language of diversity in order to then feel like, well, by this definition, we are diverse. And then here are folks who are saying, yeah, it sounds good on paper, but here's why I don't really feel like it would actually play out that well. If diversity really means what it says, it means welcoming a cross-section of society, which means that it includes racists, gun nuts, people who make dangerous lifestyle choices like crazy driving, and Tea Partiers, not to mention deadbeats and loafers. Those aren't crowds I'd prefer to spend my leisure time with, frankly. I'm all for tolerating a wide range of lifestyles, but not all of them in my backyard. So, this sense that, like, I feel comfortable with people who are like me, and in this case, political views and such. If diversity means something that's too outside my comfort zone, then I'm definitely not interested. And of course, they've painted this picture of a very, out there person who could just cause a lot of drama in the community. And it's true. I mean, there is something to be said of, like, this is their home, and they want to make sure that the people that they accept have similar values to them and similar lifestyle to them, so that it doesn't feel like it's a conflict all the time. And so I think that was where a lot of the tension was with thinking about expanding the circle and being more inclusive. Okay. More. And I certainly did not want the community to fall victim to some of our earliest errors in judgment when we accepted several persons of color more for their ethnicity than anything else. The subsequent problems resulting from that bias were divisive, expensive, and destructive to the community. So there was this tension between, okay, if we have so few, let's say, folks of color who are applying, and we say we want diversity, then we should let all of those folks in, because then we would at least have some diversity here. And, and that can cause problems, because unless you have a wide pool, you can't select from that pool those that would be most closely aligned with the values and lifestyles that you have. So that was a thing. On the other hand, what we see here is this, like, oh gosh, now we never want those kind of people again, because do you remember the last time we had that kind of person? It was a real disaster. And so, these kind of things then become stereotyping, because if you only can think of a group of people in really kind of non-nuanced, stereotyped ways, it's much harder than to imagine that there's a wide variety of folks who fit that demographic, but that their life experiences are much more broad than that. So you keep returning back to the small pieces that you know from either the media or the few experiences that you've had. Okay, so I'm gonna think a little bit about gender, race, think of each category, not broadly defined as diversity, but each category individually right now. So they had very little gender diversity, very little class diversity, and very little race diversity. So which ones are they actually framing as problematic and which ones less so? And why do they believe that the lack of diversity in those categories exists? What are they doing about it? So for the first one with gender, this was the one that was a problem, that the women of the community were very actively seeking more men to join the community. And we're doing a lot of strategies to recruit and retain those men. So part of it was that they would just say, I'll be like, well, tell me more about what you think that men could bring to the community that doesn't exist if they're not here. And they're like, oh, there's just a lot of female energy, this kind of nebulous energy. And I was like, okay. And they're like, we need just need more balance. So there's just kind of this sense that it's hard to pin down, but that is important for there to be men and women. And that also that men would be able to pull them out of sometimes the pettiness that they got into, which is, again, a very kind of gendered stereotype that women are petty and a little bit catty, and that men can focus on the more important issues and pull them out of this little pettiness. So here's a quote. That sort of pettiness that we experience wouldn't happen if men were here. And I don't know, maybe they would have reminded us, what about our commitment to mutual respect? What about our commitment to consensus and decision making? And then a very important part was, of course, the labor piece. This sense that men were handier, that they were stronger, that they could do some of the stuff that the women felt like they were less capable of doing, and they really wanted those men to bring those strengths to the community. And then finally, but not least, was dating, right? A lot of these women were still, interested in meeting somebody or meeting several people, and having that part of their life, felt like there was still room for a relationship, and they thought maybe joining a senior co-housing community could be one of those ways that they would meet somebody and get to know them and then end up in a relationship. And so when they got there and it was mostly women, or that, they just didn't find that the pool was very deep. And typically the men that do come are partnered. The single men would be the least likely category of men to come. If they come, they're usually in a relationship, so it's like couples or single women. Okay. So I said, why do you think the men are not coming? And they said, well, you need a critical mass of men for other men to feel like this is a place for them. The men that we're going to be visiting were like, oh, well, will I have friends here? Will I have people who are interested in the same things that I want to do, et cetera? And they talked about this big screen TV. They're like, we have this big screen TV here. We like to watch movies there, foreign films or whatever, but we're not allowed to watch sports on there. So maybe that's why the men are not coming. I don't know. And then they also in their planning stage, hadn't built a little garage or workshop, and thought, well, maybe that was why too, that men would want a community if they had to share tools, which is a very common thing in a lot of the intergenerational communities that do have, kind of equal balance of men and women. So what they were doing to attract men, and this was really interesting. They had a unit they were using as one of the show units. So anyone who was interested in coming to check it out could get walked through to be shown what their home might look like. And so they had it staged. And in the staging, it was very much like a man lives here, right? There was a fishing pole, like leaning against the wall, and a picture of a car on it, and just those kind of classic stereotypical guy things that they want to imagine that the guy would be there, right? So golf, poker, fishing, a tie rack, that kind of thing. Yeah. And they would give presentations in mostly libraries, and thinking that was at least going to not be a place where it was going to be exclusively women. There would be a mix there. And then in the promotional materials they always front stage men, right? So even if the community doesn't have that many men, the men are always just like front and center, just having a blast in the community, in the promotional materials. And, and I think about why there are fewer men there. I think in some ways women, are socialized to be more relational and are seeking those kinds of relationships throughout their life course in ways that men maybe are less interested or have less ability to feel like they can put themselves out there and move into this kind of community. There's also just the reality that women tend to live longer and stay healthier later into their life, so that might be part of it. And I'm happy to hear from you other thoughts on why when we get to the questions, so, okay. Class diversity, members did not cite the lack of class diversity as a problem, and in large part is because even though this is maybe not as expensive as some of the other kinds of communities that I described, it's still not inexpensive. There's a lot of upfront costs, and so people have to have a certain class comfort level in order to live in these kinds of communities, and so and if you're trying to get something going, you want to recruit people who can afford it. So members did not view themselves either as having any kind of class privilege. They viewed their circumstances as voluntary simplicity, like that they're choosing to live simply, and they feel good about that decision, because a lot of what also is going on in the background is sort of an ecological mindset. And I talked about the smaller houses, the choosing to live with less things in order to have more experiences. And so this was something that they took strongly as a value. And then, for instance, this community that I was talking about in New Mexico was required to have some affordable housing units in the community because they had gotten that the cost of land was lower than sort of market value. And so they got the benefit of having this, of this land. They put in a few lower income units. Sometimes I've seen this, and I've visited a lot of co-housing communities, both senior and intergenerational, and that can be a really positive thing. It can also be one of those strains on a community where the family that moves in, doesn't have access to the same resources that the other families do, and sometimes there's tension there, or sometimes they feel really stigmatized because they're in the low income housing unit, and everybody knows that's the one. And so those are the kind of things that can lead to some problems. At this point, I'm not even sure that these units were filled at the time. The members' bios, when you look at them on the website, even though they, see themselves as middle class and maybe even, on a fixed income now that they're in their post-working life, they do have a lot of sort of cultural capital, international experiences, markers of signifiers of the middle to upper middle class, right? So international travel, graduate degrees and professional careers. They have expensive hobbies like skiing and golfing, a lot of new age focus on yoga and spirituality, and they were also doing a lot of time-intensive volunteer and social justice work. So, okay. So just to give you a sense of the costs, you go to these workshops. They tend to be $200 to $500 in one of these cities that is not an inexpensive city. For retirees interested in creating a co-housing community, startup costs typically range from $150,000. That's on the low end. I would say that maybe that's for a very small unit in a community in a town that's not very expensive to live. When we're looking at the ones more like in Boulder or Colorado or something, I think you're more in the $500 or $600 range for a unit within the community. And then 1.2 million, I don't know of any that are that expensive, but maybe in San Francisco or very expensive locations. Monthly dues and maintenance fees, another $100 to $300. The environmental focus, so a lot of these communities are built with that intentionality to be LEED certified or really reduce the impacts environmentally, which is great and can actually lead to fewer costs in the long term, but do have a lot of expensive startup costs. And then, just navigating the city planning. Cities aren't designed for these kind of communities. So when you bring your proposal to the community, there's a lot of back and forth about how is this going to work, and it's getting better now that these are becoming more mainstream. But the first few co-housing communities that started out faced a whole range of bureaucratic obstacles that it takes a certain kind of educated person to navigate that, right? And legal fees and all the other things that those kinds of processes require. Okay. And then when it comes to race, members cite the lack of racial diversity as a problem, but not too big of a problem. It's a choice issue, right? So we have a big problem with gender, not really thinking at all about class, and a problem with race, but not sure really what to do about that, right? Or it's not so bad. They would say things like, we would like racial diversity, but we have no idea why we don't have it. And yet, unlike the gender imbalance, there was no active steps to understand and recruit. There was no deliberately recruiting at certain parts of the community where, they would tend to find more folks of a certain kind, or no modeling the house to reflect any cultural background that was, not sort of a white middle class background. So the perception, and then, again, on the promotional materials, lots of actively front staging men, but not actively front staging anyone else than, white people. So perception of the community as for white people, all promotional materials feature only white-skinned people. There was these fears of the local community and critique of the environmental practices around them. So what I mean by that is, like, in this town where I'm talking about, there's a big Latino population and a large white population. It's about half and half. And where I said the land was more affordable and it's at a slight distance from downtown also meant that it was in a community where there was more Latino people living. And I think there was this sense that, it would be nice if some Latinos wanted to come here, but also we're a little bit scared of our neighbors, which doesn't make you feel like a very, it doesn't make a very welcoming kind of place for those folks. Okay. And then I think it's also important to acknowledge that the historical trajectories of different communities, white communities and communities of color, have also meant that, for instance, I think about the Latino communities that surround this co-housing. A lot of those folks have lived there for generations. They have had less access to jobs that have taken them to other parts of the country. Their kids have had less access to education that has then resulted in them taking jobs all over the country. I mean, I'm guessing that for this group here, that a lot of your children are college educated. A lot of them have moved to cities where they found jobs, much like I left my parents in New Mexico to move to Oregon so that I could take this job at Willamette. And that's a great opportunity for me, but it also means that I don't live near my parents, and my parents don't live near their kids or their grandkids, or, And so when you think about the way that poverty or lower class families have stuck together, sometimes by choice and necessity, because you need to live near your parents because they're your daycare providers, but also because of lack of other opportunities. So sometimes those elderly from those communities don't really want to go live in co-housing because they don't have the same kind of social isolation experiences that a lot of the upper middle class white folks are experiencing, right? So they are like now living alone. Their kids are all gone to other places. They work a ton. That's not necessarily the same sort of family relationships that other types of cultural groups have. So that, I think, is one of the reasons why there's just been less interest from other groups to come and join a community like this, in addition to the fact that they're not actively recruiting and they're expensive and all of these kinds of things. So there's like so many dynamics and factors that go into this. I know I'm getting close on time because I want to leave time for questions. I'll finish up quickly. And then, some of the older members have sort of outdated ideas about racial dynamics. A lot of the folks I talk to, their only experience with anyone from another racial group was as caregivers or as cleaning folks. And so when you have those kind of staggered relationships, it doesn't make for natural and easy friendships later in life, that you have to get past a lot of the things that you grew up with and hearing. Okay, so this is kind of my last slide. I talked a little bit about social isolation from certain groups, right? White middle class post-55 folks have had smaller families than other kinds of groups. Their kids have moved away. They have worked, a lot of the women have worked outside of the home and have their own finances. And so even though now some of these women were divorced, they still had access to the kinds of resources that would allow them to opt into a community like this, or they're single parents or people living alone. In other words, this group of people tends to experience being alone more, and therefore might be the ones more likely to seek community together. Contemporary housing developments have generally been designed in a way that eliminates the need for interactions with neighbors. I know that I had this moment today, and I have great neighbors, but I had a moment today where I realized I haven't seen one of my neighbors in like 2 months because, she comes in, she closes the garage door behind her. It's winter, we don't spend time outside as much. And so, she's a single woman who, lives alone, and I need to go out there more, but of course I'm super busy and trying to get to work and all this stuff. So we don't reach out as much as we can because in some ways of the ways our neighborhoods are designed. And all of these factors contribute to alienation and loneliness for primarily white middle class, and there's an increased demand. So, there, I made it through, 15 minutes, okay. Okay, well, that's good. I think you had your hand up first. Oh, someone else is coming, okay. You'll decide, great.
I have a quick comment. I noticed the homes that you showed in the picture are all 2 stories.
Yeah.
Besides that, we are speaking from a white man's perspective. How do the Hispanics view this situation? Or how do the Negroids view this picture? Do they want the same things that we want?
Well, yeah, I mean, so because I only interviewed the folks that were actually living there, I didn't ask neighboring folks, what they thought about it, although I think that's a great idea for further research. But yeah, I mean, my sense is that those folks have their own kinds of built-in communities because of the way that, society has segregated them into certain kinds of places, and also the lack of opportunities for moving away from those spaces. So they have community, and they aren't necessarily seeking it out in the same way.
Good morning. My name is Bob. And my question is, do you think the sample that you have here is large enough to make generalizations about what it's like throughout the United States, for instance?
Yes and no. I mean, it's a small sample. This is one community. I've actually done, this particular presentation is about this one community, but I've gone to a lot of communities. I've been to the Cohousing conference many years in a row in Boulder, and it's all white middle-class people. Like, there's not a huge, it's not like it's like, wow, this is a shocking outlier. So I think you probably get different experiences in different parts of the country for where the racial makeup of those communities is different, but by and large, I think this trend holds across the U.S.
This is Ann.
Hi.
Are you thinking that this mode of living is going to prosper, or is it slowing down? It sounds horrible to me.
I think it's growing. I think there's more and more people who would like to live in this kind of environment, and I think for a lot of people, it really is a great place to live, and I mean, it is a lot of work, and I think there's the folks who want to get in from the beginning and really plan a community that they envision and be leaders. And then there's the kind who want to find a co-housing community that's already been built and buy a unit in there. And I think both options are out there. There's always communities forming. Some of them never get off the ground because the obstacles in the way are just too great, the money or the bureaucracy or the number of members, infighting. I mean, this one community almost blew up over some fruit trees. I mean, really, it's like this is because somebody really, really, really wanted fruit trees, went and bought the fruit trees. The other members realized that, like, fruit trees are a ton of work, make a mess if you don't pick the fruit. It's like they just didn't realize that this is not the right thing for them. Took water in an area that doesn't have that much water. So it doesn't matter about the fruit trees other than small things can really escalate and cause a lot of rift in the community, and people feel hurt and they feel like their friends have now betrayed them, and so it's a complicated dynamic, but that does end up working for a large number of people.
Hi, I'm right here in the middle.
Hi.
My name is Vicki, and I'm a retired city planner. Really interesting presentation to hear. I'm interested in your thoughts about such a community in Salem. I'm pretty sure there isn't one right now.
So yeah, I think there's a intergenerational community, but I don't think that there's not a senior co-housing community in Salem.
There is an intergenerational co-housing community
Yeah,
here?
so Pringle, somebody said Pringle, yeah.
Oh, I thought that was established by a developer.
Sometimes the developers come in to build the homes. I don't know enough about Pringle, but that the community itself sort of designed it, hired their own architect, and had folks, so because, the building of it does sometimes involve a developer. And there are now certain developers who primarily or exclusively do co-housing. They've become known for doing that. and tour around the country and sell themselves as the developer to hire for your co-housing community.
My name is Peter. You made a point about environmental consciousness
Yeah,
several times.
yeah.
But in the pictures you showed, I noticed solar panels on only one house. Is that representational?
Because my focus was less on that, the what exactly steps that folks had made, I don't know enough about whether there was more. I think that there probably is more, and maybe they're somewhere where you don't see them, or these were renders that didn't end up, getting built that way. It did appear to me that folks were pretty committed to the environmental piece, so long as it didn't escalate the price, exorbitantly. But I think a lot of the developers who do these kinds of projects are also conscious of that eco thing, and also wanting to make well-built homes that don't need a lot of upkeep and can keep costs low for the residents. And so I would say that regardless of what the pictures show, that it does appear to be a strong commitment that I've seen among many groups. Yeah.
Hi. Hello over here. My name is Peter.
I can't see you, but I can hear you, so.
Oh, over
okay.
here.
Oh, hi.
My question is related to diversity.
Yeah.
I wonder how it's compared to, the aging population is primarily white. Going back 40, 50 years ago, we receive, we're taking in a lot of immigrants. And when you compare the current ethnicity in the United States, are we wrongfully, with the aging population, making wrong conclusions that
Right.
we're not diverse because the current population is much more white?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I have never heard this before, but I get what you're saying, which is that when you look at the demographics of maybe the under 20 set, we're going to see more racial diversity percentage-wise than if you looked at the 60 to 80 set. Okay. Yeah, I think that you're probably right. We are seeing, not so much more immigration than we have in the past, but maybe different pockets of immigration, and also those families are having more kids than white families, which are having fewer kids. And so I think that's leading to a lot of the changes that we're seeing. So yes, I think that you're right. I don't think that it's such a dramatic change that it would, it's not like there aren't older folks who are non-white. There's a lot still, and especially if we look at communities for whom that population change hasn't really been that dramatic, like African American families. So I think that you have a point, but I don't know that it fully, accounts for the lack of diversity at these kinds of communities.
Yes, my name is Karen. I believe there's something like that going in Silverton. Are you familiar with it?
I think you're right. I think now that you say that, I'm like, it rings a bell.
Yeah, a lot of people are derogatorily saying, oh, that's a commune, but it's not. The plans that I saw really matched exactly what you're saying, with the building, parking out on the side.
Yeah.
And
Do you know if it's for seniors or will be?
I don't know what,
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't know that. I just saw a picture put out in planning, a planning picture that was put out in the little paper they have.
Well, so a commune, because actually communes is my original area of study, so I've lived on a lot of communes. Communes are by definition where they share income, so everybody pools their money together. And so it could be a commune if they were going to share their income, but likely with individual houses, that's also a way that people want to keep their personal finances to themselves and just contribute at a monthly way to the shared expenses of the community.
My name is David right here. I have friends who live in one of these near Spokane. And there are certain advantages to it, like if they were living in their own house, not in this, they wouldn't have a swimming pool.
Right.
they actually built a swimming pool for everyone. And they have other amenities that go along with living like that.
Yeah.
They have people who come in and they do the gardening for them, and they have a hotel that's attached to it. We stayed in the hotel when we stopped there. So there are certain advantages to this type of situation. And the property, I don't know exactly how it passes from one generation to another, but there are certain, I think, stipulations put in the contracts about what you can do and what you can't do.
Yeah.
And it looked like it wasn't a bad solution to some of the problems we have in other areas.
Yeah, yes, please do not mistake me, you know, offering an analysis and critique. I do think that these communities are really exciting and beneficial to a lot of people and can be a great fit. And certainly the shared resources piece is really great, you know, I mean, sometimes we only need one lawnmower because we don't all use our lawnmowers at the same time. And so it can be a good environmental lessening of all the stuff, and it can be a way to build stronger communities. It can be a way to take care of each other. Lots of positives come out of these.
This is Charlene. This is Charlene. I want to focus on the transitions. When a community is there and somebody dies, do they have a waiting list? Do they have to go out and recruit? Who decides who comes in?
Yeah.
How is all that handled?
I mean, I think it depends on the community, but typically some of them have sort of a transitional time of membership where you would be like a temporary member while people get to know you and see if it's going to work out. But oftentimes they just need to sell that house because, you know, it's important that somebody lives there and pays the dues and, you know, and keeps it occupied. And so they, you know, kind of just take whoever can afford to buy that house. I haven't really seen too many with long waiting lists, although I imagine that there are some. So I don't know. I should know more about what exactly happens, because this was such a new community too, and a lot of the ones I was working with, they were new, and it would be interesting to revisit them in 10 years when membership has rotated. You know, these were all exuberant, excited new members who were happy that their community had finally gotten off the ground. They were eager to show me their brand new houses and stuff. So I haven't been back since to see if what life is like now that they're all settled in.
Yeah, this is Danny. I was wondering what the surrounding community thinks of these folks. Do they think of them at all? Do they think they're odd? Do they have interactions beyond transactional matters? Is there interaction between this community and the other communities that surround it?
You know, I live next to a co-housing community, and I never even knew it was there. You know, it blends right in, kind of. And so I think that for a lot of the communities around, it's just another apartment building looking thing or another set of small subdivision or whatever. You know, it's not immediately apparent that this is a particular thing and folks are thinking about it. Then again, I think about, you know, your comment about Silverton. In a small town like that, there must be, you know, rumblings going around and gossip or murmurings about what this thing is, and maybe it depends on the size of the town. I mean, here we have this Pringle one in Salem, and a lot of the folks here haven't heard about it and, you know, don't know much about it. So I think they kind of fly under the radar of their local communities.
I think we'll have to take a break now.
Okay.
And save questions for later.
Okay. So this next part, I'm going to, I don't have a formal presentation. I just wanted to share with you all a little bit about the 2 new roles that I've taken on in the institution, how we got to needing this role, how I got to be the person filling the role, what sorts of initiatives that we're working on, and also talk a little bit more about the Title IX piece. Some of you might be familiar with Title IX. It's been in the news a lot. Sort of a little background on what the law says, and then how we implement those kinds of things at Willamette, and then speak more specifically to the processes that would impact the Collegian article that some of you may have read, and I can give you some feedback on that too. So I'll quickly start with the diversity piece. As was mentioned in the intro, I've been a sociology professor here for 9 years, and throughout that time there have been a lot of people working on diversity initiatives, equity initiatives, an attempt to get more faculty of color hired in the CLA and the other schools. There's just been a lot of efforts put in and a lot of support systems for students from diverse backgrounds. But there hasn't ever been an office that was working to connect the folks that were doing work together, making sure that the work there wasn't things slipping through the cracks while other things were being done here and then done at the law school again, and no one was talking to each other. So someone that had sort of broad oversight on all of these initiatives, and as well as someone who is in a position of high enough power to be able to say, like, we need to do this, and then have folks actually, say, okay, this is a priority. It's a VP has now said this. So President Thorsett asked me, I guess about a year and a half ago, to co-lead a task force with some other administrators to see if this was a good idea to have this position at Willamette. And we're certainly not the first. In fact, we're coming in behind a lot of other schools in terms of having this position. So our Northwest 5 peers, which we often collaborate with, which is Reed, Whitman, Lewis and Clark, Puget Sound, they all had a chief diversity officer by different names. Some of them is the dean of diversity, some are the vice president of diversity. But that kind of overall language of chief diversity officer across the schools is also something that a lot of businesses have. I mean, it's likely that in some of your places of employment or former employment, they have a position like this now. So it is a growing kind of trend. And President Thorsett had always had in his mind this idea that it was everybody's job to do this work. It wasn't going to be one specific person's job, and that a good university meant that everybody took this as a priority, and then we would get the work done that way. But I think increasingly he had come to realize that it's easier to say that it's everybody's job, and than it is to sort of make sure everybody is taking that as a priority, and that there is some utility in having a senior level person oversee, mandate, organize, serve as a resource for all those kinds of things that gets this job done. So he had asked us to do this task force. So we went and we interviewed students and faculty and staff. We presented at all of the colleges. We invited CDOs from the other schools to come in and tell us about their jobs. And we wrote up a long report that finally said, President Thorsett, we think that you should choose to hire someone in this position. And we talked a lot about who that someone might be. And one of the things that emerged was there was this kind of tension among the group between, do we hire someone external who has fresh eyes on Willamette, who can bring in new ideas from another institution that can show us what we might not be seeing because we're too in it? Or do we hire someone internal who already has a lot of connections across campus, who's a well-respected person, who doesn't feel like some outside diversity police coming in to tell us how to do things? And we decided to go the second route and do an internal hire for at least 3 years. And so my position is a 3-year position that at the end of those 3 years, I can go back to my teaching job, which is being held for me in the sociology department. I remain tenured there. Or I can apply to this role along with other candidates from outside, and then a hiring committee can make the decision then about what's best for the institution. So it's not necessarily an interim role, but it is a marked role of time where I can do this job and still, decide that teaching is really more my wheelhouse. So far, I'm in it. This is about my 6th or 7th month, and it's going really well, and I'm enjoying it, although the workload is great. But it's been really fascinating to me to move from one part of campus, a very academic piece within a department, to an administrative role. And I do think that those connections were helpful. I think part of what we were also thinking by going internal is that we didn't really know what the job was yet. It was hard to write a job description, for something that didn't already exist. So part of my role in these 3 years is to kind of figure it out. Who should report in to me? How should resources be managed? What kinds of duties should I have so that we can write a clear description for someone who might be coming in from external. So that's how this job started. Later on, maybe about in November, we recognized that our current Title IX person was going to be moving on, Jackie Balzer, and so she had given plenty of notice. And so there was this, Steve came back and asked, this President Thorset, can you think about who might be a good fit for this position? Does this look like something that you might take on, that you would have the capacity for, or do we need to find something else? And so I, again, did the same thing I had done before to a much smaller degree, where I interviewed folks who were doing this kind of work at other schools, the Title IX work, and I realized that it was kind of a natural fit for this umbrella, right? So this is about gender equity and Title IX mandates, and then the rest of my job is also about, equity and inclusion of all kinds of other categories. So that's how then in January, when our current Title IX person left, we immediately added that to my title, because it's mandated that every school have one, so you can't have any time where you don't have a Title IX person. So I want to talk just a little bit about what I do in my job now that I set it up. As I mentioned before, it's this idea that Willamette, was built for a particular kind of student, and now, in part because we've recruited, and in part because of demographic changes, we now have a much different kind of student body. One of the things I talk about is we have an increasing number of students who identify as non-binary. And for those of you that don't know what that means, it means that they identify as neither man or woman, right? They think of themselves as a category that doesn't fall neatly into one of those two categories. And so our school is designed to serve men and women. And so if you're non-binary, then we have issues of what bathroom will you use? How do we mark you on the structures of your transcript? Typically it says Mr. James, Brown, and Ms., Jane, whatever. So now we need to think about alternatives to meeting that student where they're at. And that's one example. The other examples are we have a lot of students now who can get to Willamette because we give them a fair amount of merit aid, but once they're here, there's a lot of expenses that are just don't allow them to focus on their education, right? So textbooks have become increasingly expensive. Food, all living expenses, all of those kinds of things. Like, how do I create support systems, and we as an institution create support systems that allow them to not worry so much about that. So for instance, one student-led initiative is the First Generation Book Drive, where they've collected books, they've organized it in their own kind of library, and when students can't afford to pay for a book, they go to their resources and see if they have that book and lend it to the student for the semester. If they don't have that book, they try to make an effort to get it, or there's a pool of money that we can use to get that student that book. So those are all the kinds of just like small things that make a big difference in the lives of our students and supporting them. We have a number of undocumented students at Willamette. They also face a lot of barriers because they don't get to do the FAFSA, financial aid piece that that would then allow them to qualify for certain kinds of scholarships and aids. So how do we work with those students? And if you haven't had students like that in the past, then you don't have systems in place that work to support those students. So, I could go on and on. There's so many different kinds of students that we have now who we need to meet the needs of. And this isn't just like we're going above and beyond. Increasingly, as we look, we had today is Founders Day, and so the president gave us a little talk this morning about the challenges of higher ed in general, and the idea that there are fewer of the kinds of, well-off students who can afford to pay for the kind of school that we are, just full price. That pool is dwindling, and in order to get the number of students that we need to stay viable as an institution, we have to go out there and recruit in first-generation college students, students from diverse class backgrounds, diverse racial backgrounds, and bring them here, and not just to get them here and check off a box like, we're great, look how diverse our students are, but that get them here and help them succeed, right? Get them through to graduation, because that feels really important to me as part of my job. I don't want to just get students here, I want to make sure they graduate, because leaving here halfway with no degree and a lot of student loans is leaving them worse than they started with. You know, that is not my intention at all. So I'm trying to figure out where those students face obstacles and then trying to find them the support that they need to be successful college students. That's what we want them to be. My job is across all 3 schools, and it's also across faculty, students, and staff. So I've talked a little bit about students and the kinds of support systems we put in there. I think one of the other areas I've thought a lot about is staff. When we think about the university, I think students and faculty get a lot of the attention and focus, and we have an amazing, you know, pool of staff folks that work here at all kinds of levels that also need some attention and are also increasingly diverse. So we have folks, you know, who I think about wage equity a lot. How do we make paychecks fair for the people that work here? And, you know, who's really struggling right now, and we need to give them a little bump, even if it means that other folks can't get quite as high of a raise this year. So thinking about wage equity, thinking about diversity in hiring. I've just started a new program where every single job search at Willamette will, and it's in a pilot program right now, so it's optional, but eventually my hope is that it will become instituted. Every job search has someone who sits on the search who's well trained in how job searches go to help the group of folks making the hire to think deeply about how do we create a bigger pool? How do we think about people's experiences in a more broad way so that we can make sure that we're not just selecting someone who looks just like the person who was here before or someone who looks just like you, and you know, then we end up having a staff that isn't diverse and therefore then doesn't meet the needs of the students who are seeking a reflection in the staff and faculty of folks who look like them too. So those are a lot of the things that I've been working on. I'll quickly move to the Title IX piece because I want to leave time for questions for you all on either this role or the other one. The Title IX is a federal mandate, and you know, some people are like, well, why do we care about the federal? We're a private school, we can do what we want. We are required because we still rely on federal dollars. A lot of our students bring federal dollars to us to pay for their school, right, through loans and whatnot. So that's really important, and also it's just the right thing to do, to follow these laws. But the laws basically say there has to be equity in gender for men and women in universities, all educational experiences, but we're focusing on universities. And so historically, that has been seen most often in athletics, and maybe that's where you've heard it more commonly, that there would have to be an equal number of men's and women's teams, and that the resources for men's and women's teams would need to be similar. So for instance, right at Willamette right now, we have a new lacrosse team for women in order to make sure that we have parity on men's and women's teams. And the lacrosse teams need lockers, and so because they didn't have lockers, in order to be fair to them, we are making sure that they have a locker room of their own, just like the men's teams have. So that's part of the Title IX piece through athletics. The other part that has really become much more talked about recently, and I'd say in the last 5 years or something, is that women who were being sexually assaulted on their campuses or harassed were saying, actually, this is a Title IX issue because I don't have the same educational opportunity as men do because of these kinds of assaults that are happening predominantly to women. And Title IX looks at gender across the board, so all of my work actually focuses on sexual misconduct for both men and women, although when we think about it as a gender issue, there is a disproportionate effect on women. So the women were using that, and so the federal government then sent out a letter, and it's called the Dear Colleague letter, and they sent it to schools and said, you need to be doing these things in order to make sure that the climate is good for women on your campus. And it required colleges to do any number of things, but basically set up what is kind of like a little investigation/court system that's outside of the criminal justice system that is specifically for Willamette students, a conduct system that we use for other things, not just sexual misconduct. Like if students are drinking in the dorms or something and they're not supposed to be, they would go through the same conduct violation system. But it's a complicated matter, especially when when it comes to things that are, notoriously hard to prove about what happened in interpersonal relationships, or what happened at a party one night when people are intoxicated. And so this is like, there's a lot of best practices now, there's a lot of training that schools have gone through, and we've come a long way since that Dear Colleague letter in terms of being sure that we have a process in place that fairly responds and to a person who's complaining of being sexually violated, and someone who's responding to being accused of that, right? We have to be fair to both sides. We have to investigate thoroughly those the circumstances that led to this, what happened in the moment, and then we need a fair and well-trained hearing board that can assess the punishment or the implications for the person who's found responsible for that, whether that means expelling them from our community, whether that means suspension, community service, whatever, depending on the degree of the violation. So that's kind of the nutshell of it. This particular case, just to catch folks up that haven't heard, this was a case of a student who had been found responsible for sexual misconduct at a former institution, and now was discovered by these collegian reporters to be now at our campus. And so there was a lot of concern that the vetting process for making sure that we aren't, letting in violators into our campus, even though that this student who's in question didn't necessarily do the misconduct here at Willamette. He had a record from a former institution. So, to that, so they've written up this thing, and it got people pretty scared on campus about the process. So I've spent a lot of time in the last couple weeks talking to students about what we do and what that might look like. And, they, even though I can't talk about that specific case, they throw examples of, well, what about this or what about that? So I'll kind of give you a little bit of what do we do. Typically, in that kind of circumstance, there are two options for students to self-disclose this. They need to write it on their application. So on the application to Willamette, they say things like, were you ever found responsible for misconduct at a former institution? And so they have the option there to disclose. Also, when they are going to play a sport, in this case, the student is an athlete, they also are asked by coaches and others, like, now would be a good time to tell me if you have a conduct violation. And this could be anything, whether it was, I got caught drinking, or yeah, I stole a bike when I was in high school. Whatever it is, that should come up at that point. At the point then something like that emerges, there's a risk assessment team on campus. Our number one priority is to keep students safe. So we look at that violation, and let's say it's a bike theft. Okay, what were the circumstances of this bike theft? How long ago was it? How do we feel about this person now? What are the risks involved with bringing this bike theft person to campus? And if we agree that the risks are low, then that person could continue to go through their admission process. Now, in cases of, violent sexual assault, the risk, we would probably say, well, that seems like too high of a risk to bring that person to campus. We don't want to take that risk. Let's not admit. And so that threat assessment team meets on all of these cases. It also falls on the responsibility of the school, who a student might be transferring, to disclose that information to us. And if they don't disclose that information to us, a lot of students are like, well, is that illegal? And I wouldn't say that it's illegal, but I think it violates a code of ethics among schools, and you could report it to like an accreditation body, and they might get some kind of, ding on their report that says, listen, you're not engaging in best practices in this, you need to fix this. So those are the things that happen when we know of a case. And if we don't know of a case, and we find out later that someone came in and lied about their prior misconduct, then we would put them through the conduct process for lying, right? So they would go, now they've been caught lying about something, and so they go through the conduct process and get whatever the punishment for lying is by the hearing board. We can't repunish them for the thing that they did at the former institution. That they've already been punished for. They've already done their suspension, or maybe they got expelled from that institution. That's not on us to go back and revisit that. And there's some concern in that Collegian article is like, how can Willamette punish that person for what they did before? And we are not going to do that. We can only punish them for the kind of things that they have done here currently as our student. So, with that, I'd be happy to answer questions about all of the above. I've talked your ear off now for 20, 30 minutes.
Does anyone have the other mic, by the way? We seem to have misplaced it.
One gets the impression from the Collegian that possibly the majority of students are against that decision not to punish this young man. Is that true?
I mean, yeah, I think students are scared by what they read. I think they feel like the institution needs to do something and aren't clear on what they are doing. I don't feel like people shouldn't be punished twice. For the same crime. They went through their process at their former institution. That was decided. That just coming to another school. I mean, this is something that I think a lot about because, we think about what is the range of these violations. It can be great. And at what point can you draw that line and say, this person no longer deserves a college education? I mean, I can understand maybe not deserving to play a sport. Possibly. But a college education is a really important marker in people's future lives. And so that's a big deal to say, we think that you, because of what you've done, and again, where do you draw the line of what you've done, can't get an education here or anywhere. Because I think about someone who would lie on their application, and I certainly don't condone that at all. But as a sociologist who has looked at criminal justice systems, not the student conduct one, but the criminal justice system, we recognize that there are a number of people, because of their felony records, can't even get a job anywhere, right? And so what does that mean for them in terms of how they can be productive citizens in our communities? And I think about the person who came up in the very beginning to talk about, I think you mentioned something about having a felony record. And I was thinking about that in relationship to this, because what we also need to do is to think about ourselves as educators. So we want to continue to educate people for doing dumb things. In this case, it was more than just dumb, but it was a lot of students do things that are completely inappropriate and learn from them and don't do them again. And from protecting students from people who are actually violent and serial predators. Those people we don't want on our campus. The kind of people who make a mistake and change, those people we see as viable community members in a school that is here to support and help students grow. But having people go through a conduct process again if they didn't do anything new wrong, then that doesn't feel fair, and certainly we wouldn't start doing that at Willamette.
Hi, this is Ingrid. I have a question regarding your previous presentation.
Sure.
If a person wants to move into that community, did I understand correctly that they buy their own house and they take care of their own house? They only share certain amenities?
Yes. In this particular community, they do buy their own house. In other communities that I've seen, sometimes, especially in what they call retrofit communities, it's like an apartment complex that they might buy together. Then sometimes there's like a rental unit process, kind of more similar to like a nursing home where you pay a monthly fee to the organization. But most of the ones I see are owner owned, I guess. Yeah.
So it really isn't that different, only on a smaller scale than other neighborhoods where they have let's say, shared amenities and do things together.
Right, yeah. Yeah, we talked about this with some folks here about how is this different than maybe just a gated community? And I think when you look on the face of it, there aren't that many differences, except for that in intention, it feels quite different. Like these folks would be like, oh, no, we are not a gated community. We're this other kind of thing where we have a much stronger intention of communality, right? So like we want to spend more time together. A gated community, they share their amenities, right? They can all use the pool and the little house, maybe rent it out, but they don't necessarily plan on having meals together every Tuesday night. And so that would be one of the ways in which they're somewhat different. Yeah.
My name is Kay, and I have a question about gender equity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware that 20 years ago, very few colleges were meeting gender equity requirements. And the University of the Pacific in California took the step of eliminating football as a sport to move them into gender equity.
Hmm.
I wondered if you could update me. Well, as you can imagine, that was a very controversial decision. Could you update us on how many colleges are actually in gender equity these days, or a percentage, and whether Willamette is in gender equity?
If you're talking about sports teams, yes, we are, and I would say every college is, if they want to continue to get funding. So I think some of them have had struggles, and eliminating men's sports has been challenging in the sense that it really upsets men to have to lose something for gender equity. So what most schools have done is to be adding women's teams so that there's the same amount, which costs a lot too. You know, there's a lot of benefit to having athletics, and our student athletes are some of the most, you know, engaged students, and they have great time management skills because they have to, you know, do both. But it does cost other schools and Willamette a lot of money to have all of these schools and have them all be equal in terms of who gets what resources. So, yeah.
Good morning. This is Bob again. ICL has an objective of trying to diversify its body, and I would like to hear what Willamette's general objectives are concerning diversity and how you go about trying to meet them.
I mean, Willamette certainly doesn't have any kinds of quotas or, you know, I think in general, one of the big stated commitments in which we have done much better than our peer institutions is this commitment to access. And President Thorset talks about it a lot, and not just talks about it, but actually does it. We have a higher discount rate, which means that we give more aid to students who might not otherwise be able to afford to come here. And so that's a really positive thing. And it also means that because we are reaching out to folks who might not otherwise be able to afford to come here, we do tend to get then more racial diversity because of that. So I don't know that there's a stated commitment to diversity, and there's also a recognition that even if we didn't state it, it's happening. It's just the reality of the changing world, and so we would need to be prepared for it and accommodate the changing demographics of our students. And so I think there's both a commitment and a recognition that regardless, it's coming, and we need to be ahead of it.
Hi, this is Anne, and I wanted to know what kinds of programs Willamette has for students regarding sexual inappropriateness, and how those work.
Yeah, well, we have a person in the role of prevention specialist, and she comes up with all kinds of learning opportunities. Oftentimes they're fun and involve spinning the wheel and who knows, like, you know, just engaging things to teach students about consent, about sobriety, about risky behaviors in general, about what stalking looks like, what harassment might look like, how to have good, solid, loving relationships that don't end up with violence or harassment or assault. And so that's one effort. We also, have all of these things built into our orientation programs. We have them built into, the RAs, which are the residence assistants, the folks that live on the floors with the residents, who are also college students. There's a lot of training for them. I think that students are aware of it. I also think that we live in a culture, and as we've seen with this whole Me Too movement, where there's a culture that's already established where these things happen, and we are trying to get ahead of it and make sure that we can be on the prevention side. But like everywhere else, Willamette will have instances of sexual misconduct. And one of the things that I was most worried about with this Collegian article, I'm not here to protect the institution. I don't want, this not to come out because I feel like it puts us in a bad light. That none of those things are true. The reason I was concerned is because I feel like if students don't trust our Title IX process to serve them, then they won't report the instances that have occurred for them, and then we won't be able to give them the resources. So for instance, when a student comes to us and says, this happened to me, I'm really upset, I'm in shock, I don't know what to do, we walk them through all kinds of resources that we have on campus. We can help them talk to their professors about extending deadlines for things because they're in a state of trauma right now. We can make sure they don't live on the same floor as their assailant. We can make sure that we have restricted contact so that they don't have to eat at the dorm or at the cafeteria at the same time. Somebody could come in the first half of dinner and someone can come in the second half of dinner so you don't have to bump into each other. We get them resources for counseling. We walk them through if they want to report to the police. All those kinds of things are really valuable tools that we can offer people in a time of crisis, that if they don't believe that they're going to get help because the school is just trying to hide it or we're not doing the right thing, then they won't come forward. And so my goal as a Title IX officer coordinator is to increase the number of reports we get. I know that I'll be successful in my job when we can increase the number of reports we get, because that means that people are coming forward and asking for our help because they trust that we will be able to help them.
Hi, Professor or Vice President Aguilar, your new title. I'm Lee, and this is about cultural diversity. As you may have noticed by looking through the audience, we really badly need cultural diversity within the Institute here. Can you help us as a Secret Agent 008 to pull together more cultural outreach so that we can recruit maybe through the media, through La Pantera and Hispanic and other newspapers and other media, and even the fact that lately we've been getting people like Senator Winters here, that we can publicize the fact that our speakers are culturally diverse, even though our audience is not. I think we should use that as a kind of an outreach technique.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah, and
so let's work together on that.
I would be happy to connect with some of your organizers because that is some of the work that I've been doing on campus. I've been meeting with the Collegian staff. I met with the ASWU, which is the student government. I've met with the RAs, and all of them want to think about how do we engage in best practices as an organization within an organization on outreaching to, I look at ASWU, that's the student government. I'm like, how are you recruiting people to run? How are you collecting data on who's running and who's getting elected? How are you giving out money? They have a lot of money to give out because they collect student fees and then they can use those fees. How are you checking that your the fees that you're giving out are actually going to a diverse group of students? And so those are the kinds of self-assessment questions that I help them go through, and I have a whole series of questions that are good for different organizations that, one, I could easily pass off to you. I'm also happy to engage in further conversation where you do some self-reflection. How are members chosen for ICL? How can we do better at recruiting? And often it involves starting a small subcommittee of folks who are going to take on the task of looking internally at your own practices and seeing how you can have better equity and inclusion in your group.
Is this working? Yeah? Oh, good. Okay. More than 30 years ago, Antioch College had a program similar to what you're describing, recruiting minority students. Very successful in recruiting. The students did not come with equal preparation, as a rule.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what sort of support services do you have to help these students succeed?
Yeah, I think that we experience that here as well. We have the similar experience of, maybe different preparations and backgrounds, like, some people who have gone to preparatory high schools versus their local public high school, which hasn't prepared them as well. So there's that piece. Then there's the piece of supporting those students when they come here and feel isolated because, I mean, I hear across the board, I have students from, small towns in Montana who are like, oh my gosh, this is the most diverse place I've ever been. And then I get students from California who are like, this is absolutely the whitest place I've ever been. So helping students to navigate that, what feels to them like a really jarring transition. College is often a time where people have identity, where they come to have strength in certain identities. And so we've seen that, like, even if students, African American students, I'll just use as an example, have come here and they've always recognized that they're African American and they grew up in an African American community, the sense of feeling now more singular strengthens that identity for them, and they, it becomes a more salient piece of who they are now. And that, so we know these trajectories exist when students go through a college experience. So we both support them in that academic thing where we tend to, over the summer, when we're putting those students into certain classes, we recognize which teachers might be the most able to help them navigate that gap, and then strategically put them in with those faculty. We have a whole learning center of trained folks who understand the backgrounds of a lot of things, where students struggle typically to feel confident to speak in class. I mean, Willamette's one of those schools where small classes means we're going to have discussion, and if you don't feel confident with your voice and what you have to say, and other students intimidate you because they seem so smart, you're going to struggle. And so how do we acknowledge those, recognize them, one, and acknowledge that this might be not because you're not smart, but because you haven't been exposed to these kinds of ideas, or you don't have the same confidence, or you were in a high school that had 50 students in a class, so nobody spoke out loud, versus a smaller school where students were trained to do that. So a lot of it is having those, actual structures in place, but a lot of it is training faculty too. So we do a lot of training for faculty. This semester, for instance, we had the diversity officer from Reed came and did a whole day presentation for faculty on creating inclusive classrooms. In 2 weeks, we have a woman from Clark College in Vancouver who's coming to do a whole thing on meeting the needs of our transgender students. And then in March, we'll have an expert from California who is an OCR lawyer for ADA issues. And he's going to come and talk to us about how to better accommodate our students with mental health concerns, physical health concerns. How do we make sure that our school isn't, keeping them out and not giving them access to the kind of education that they can have? How do we be better at creating a syllabus that meets the needs of students who are facing health concerns? So all those ways is part of my job, to get the expertise in here and help folks recognize where the problems are.
Hi, I'm Karen. I just wanted to make sure that you understand that at ICL, I'm on the diversity. I was on the diversity committee.
Oh.
And it is very hard to determine how we can get a more diverse group in here.
Okay.
But we do work and have successful brought in speakers who are diverse and addressing diversity itself. But as far as ICL, the only selection process, the only requirement is age. Everyone gets in.
Yeah.
So it's not
right
a selection process we could, establish, because
Yeah.
you apply, you get in. You're on a waiting list, but you get in.
Yeah.
Charlene again. I am so impressed with your presentation, your thinking, everything about you.
Thank you.
Would you be
All right, well.
would you be comfortable in sharing a little bit about your background and how you, your schooling and how you got here?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a great town, and my mother is from France, and my father is a Latino man from New Mexico, and they met. This is a great story. They met because he was drafted in the Navy, which that's not the great part. So he went on his boat, and for the Vietnam War, and he landed in France, and he met my mom, and they started to exchange letters. they were pen pals, apparently. And the letters got increasingly romantic. And so when she turned 18, he went back to France and proposed, and they settled in New Mexico, which is where my whole extended family is. So when I'm thinking about, the role of that extended Latino family and the way they take care of each other in a particular way, my family all still lives in New Mexico. But then I went to college in Colorado, and I got a business degree, which a lot of first-gen students tend to want to get more practical degrees because they see it as a pathway to a higher level social class standing and something that will be practical so that they can get a job. That felt really important to me, and I had big aspirations of the business world. And after I graduated, I had a great experience in college. I went to Colorado State University, which is a big state school, nothing like Willamette, but still a great experience. And then I moved to Japan to teach English. I wanted to expand my horizons, and so that's also why when I came to interview here, the connection that we have with TIU and TIUA is really special to me because I've spent a lot of time in Japan myself at that time, and then later with the opportunity to go there through Willamette and our exchange programs. So I did that for a little while, and then I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and I thought maybe business because that was where my original studies were in. But then I thought, because I was a marketing major, and I thought, what I love about marketing is understanding why people do it, why they do what they do, but not so much actually wanting to sell them anything. And I'm like, what is that field? Sociology. So I ended up going back to graduate school in Boulder, Colorado, for a PhD in sociology, and I got really interested in gender issues in particular. So I have a focus with gender and sexuality. So here, when I do teach classes at Willamette, they're in family sociology, sexualities, gender and society. Those are the names of my courses. Those are the things that I'm most interested in, and in communes. So I did my dissertation is a study of communes mostly in the Northeast, but across the U.S., which there are not so many communes anymore, full income sharing communities. And these communes were unique in that they were really trying out new alternatives in gender and sexuality. So a lot of them were non-monogamous. They were polyamorous communities. They, were trying to be more flexible with gender identity and such. So I started to think a lot about the alternatives of gender and that. And when I went on the job market, luckily, Willamette at the time was recruiting for a gender sociologist. So I landed here, and I love Oregon. It's a good fit for me. Coming up, I lived in New Mexico and then Colorado, then Utah. I feel like I'm just working my way up northwest, and I feel landed here. I have a partner who I've been together with my partner since undergrad, and it's one of those things that has worked, and she currently works at Nike, so it was a good fit for her as well. So we are happily settled in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah.
Thank you many times. You are the busiest woman on this campus, the busiest person on this campus, and we would like you to come back again sometime.
I would be happy to. If there are more questions, I'm happy to answer a couple more.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have the mic. Going back to this case with the student, could you comment a little bit on all the triggers that have been?
The triggers? Well, say more what you mean by triggers, like the way it's impacted students?
Pardon?
The way that it has impacted students?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. They're talking about it, they're writing about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm hopeful that despite the fact that it feels like Willamette is not doing anything, that this has given us the opportunity to really show the students what we do and explain the process to them better. So, next week I have my entire Title IX team, which includes, our campus safety director, our residence hall director, our, admissions person, everybody will come up and talk about what their piece of the puzzle is, and the way that we really do make every effort to make sure this is a safe campus, that we hold people accountable for their misbehavior. And I think a lot of folks just didn't really know, one, about the resources that were available, and two, about the process that people go through, because it is so confidential, right? That's what's frustrating to the students. They want to know, and I'm telling them, I can't tell you. And admittedly, if they were the ones in the situation, either as the victim or the respondent, they would probably not want the whole, it's a small campus, so word gets around. So, we must be confidential, but we also must make sure that students don't feel unsafe. One student asked me if it was possible to have kind of like a sex offender registry on campus. And while I think we could do that as we cross lists with Salem Police to make sure that none of our current students are on a sexual, offender registry, it would be hard to publish that kind of thing internally of our own students who have been found responsible. Because I know that even though students feel like they should know if somebody among them has been found responsible for a sexual violation, some of these things are so nuanced, and this is the thing that I didn't even quite fully understand until I started to read the case files. And it is a complicated thing. You think it's going to be clear cut. This happened. Oh yes, we know. But it's not. I mean, the students' lives, and they text each other, and they have all kinds of, they're up at all hours of the night that seem completely bizarre and inappropriate to people who sleep on a normal sleep schedule. But it's not. It's the way that student lives are. It's not weird to have somebody knocking at your door at 2:30 in the morning, because that happens all the time. So just learning sort of the way that students live their lives, then you can read their cases from the perspective of like, this seems inappropriate, and yet it is totally normal in a dorm room kind of situation. So those are the challenges. Some of the other things that have happened is that this references a person who plays on a sports team. Well, unfortunately, a lot of men play on sports teams at our school, and there have been cases of misidentity where people think they know who this is, and people are now being accused of things that they are not responsible for. So those are the kind of things that we want to kind of not, hide, but like remind folks that you can't just throw around gossip if you don't really know the circumstances, because people get hurt by that when they're being misaccused of something. So those are some of the repercussions.
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
It would seem, as the term of your temporary position ends, and you're trying to decide whether to go back into the classroom, it seems you don't need to teach sociology because you are sociology on the campus. I mean, you're demonstrating it with your involvement. Not to push you into staying in that job, but it seems, I just can't imagine you're having a greater impact in the classroom than you're having now on the whole campus.
Well, and either way, somebody will be in this role. I mean, it's certainly not going to go away after 3 years. So, but I mean, right now I feel excited about the role, and I'm looking forward to finishing out my term and maybe staying if that feels right for me at the time. So.
Well, as Anne said before, I think we really thank you for all these perspectives and new ideas.
It's been fun to come.
Thank you.
Yeah.